Hello. Welcome, dear participants, to the ASL, the TESOL Digital Hepatology meeting. This is the last two sessions of the first day. Me and Dr. Yarash will moderate the two sessions. First of all, Dr. Ray Kim will summarize the Traınee Workshop, and then we will divide into two parts, two halls for breakout sessions. Yes, Dr. Yarash, do you want to say something about this?
Thank you very much, and hello to everyone. I'm very honored to be the moderator of this session. Thank you very much.
And after the breakout sessions, the Traınee workshop will be placed as pre-recorded. We will not take questions about these sessions, and these sessions will be placed in TESOL website online after the meeting. Hello, Reiki. Welcome, and this is your turn. Thank you very much.
Alın araya.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. And it's again so nice to see familiar faces. And I concur with everybody that it would have been much nicer to be in person, but that's coming in the future. So without further ado, I'm going to summarize the contents of the lecture videos that you will be seeing this evening and reviewing further on, so that we can have some common basis for us to conduct the workshop today. We are usually doing workshop a little bit longer, and online, digital, it's a bit more challenging as well. So one may question, what can we achieve with 3 hours of workshop? And there is clearly no way that one can master research methodology in a few hours of studying, but I hope that we will inspire you to engage in scientific research. We will orient you to go to the right direction so that you don't have to spend so much time to try to figure out where you need to learn and what content you need to learn. And more importantly, I hope to provide opportunities for you to connect with people with the right expertise, so perhaps you can continue the relationship beyond this workshop. So I have a few questions to see how much you know about research. The first question is, in a case control study to investigate whether hepatitis B virus infection causes hepatocellular carcinoma, if you do a case control study, what are the controls? Is it subjects with hepatitis B infection? Is it subjects without hepatitis B infection? Is it subjects with HCC? Or is it subjects without HCC? Or is it subjects without hep B infection and without HCC? There isn't a good way for me to capture your response, but think about what your selection is for this question. Second question, you plan to explore the impact of age on liver cancer development in your database of people with liver disease. The cohort sample size is 1,000 people, and you follow them forward. You find HCC in 30 people. You plan for statistical analysis, which is Cox regression method, and you want to adjust for sex, liver disease etiology, cirrhosis or not, diabetes or not, BMI, and smoking status. Some of these variables are missing in 10% of the subjects. is there a problem? What is the problem? Number one, you did not include other possible confounders. You need more variables to adjust. Number two, the number of patients with HCC is too small. Number three, you're adjusting for too many variables. Number four, there is too much missing data. Number five, there is no problem. Is there a problem? What is the most important problem? Think about that. Number three, which of the following is true of meta-analysis? Number one, they should only include randomized clinical trials. Number two, it assumes all trials include very similar patients, interventions, and outcomes. Number three, larger variance indicates higher quality data. Number four, fixed effects models are particularly useful if there is a high level of heterogeneity. And number five, random effect models are better suited for a small number of studies, such as less than 5. This one is a little tough, but I hope you made your choice. All right. So please watch the lecture videos and you will get the answers, but I will provide answers at the end of this summary. So I am going to summarize the talks in a few manageable slides, and I'm going to start with my own observational studies. In my talk, I talk about cohort study and case control studies, and this is a scheme for cohort study. You start with a beginning cohort where you determine the exposure variable, which is what is the risk, and you will find out who have hepatitis B and who don't have hepatitis B, and you will follow them forward in time to determine who develops HCC, who doesn't develop HCC. This is a study that number one question asked, is hepatitis B a risk factor for liver cancer? Once you have done this longitudinal follow-up cohort, then you will have a 2x2 table, hepatitis B patients developing HCC, that's A, hepatitis B patients that are not developing HCC, hepatitis B, patients without hepatitis B developing HCC, and those without hepatitis B not developing HCC. Those are the 4 possible combinations, right? So once you have those data, then you can calculate the ultimate metric, which is relative risk. So this is an example of a cohort study done by Yang, published in New England Journal of Medicine. Large number of patients followed for a long period of time, and you have a 2x2 table, and you also have a total column, which is there were 2,300 patients with hepatitis B. Some developed HCC, some didn't, and more patients without hepatitis B. Many didn't develop HCC, but some developed HCC. And you can calculate the instance of liver cancer among those with surface antigen, that is here, and then negative ones here. And then you can calculate the risk between those two, relative risk, that shows hepatitis B increases risk by about 12 times. So that's the gold standard for observational study, a cohort study design. A case control study, you do it backwards. You go from the right side to the left side. And that means you determine who have HCC and who don't have HCC, and then determine the risk factors sort of backwards. So you get similar 2x2 table, but the setup is quite different than the cohort study. So the question that I asked at the beginning, which are the controls in the case control study? In this setup, we're trying to determine whether hepatitis B causes HCC. Cases are those with HCC. Controls are those without HCC. Sometimes people get confused that people without hepatitis B are the controls, and that would be wrong. And that really emphasizes the importance of defining cases and controls correctly in a case control study. This is an example where investigators analyzed the impact of alcohol use on HCC. So they found 70 cases with HCC and 70 patients without HCC. And then they went back and asked about alcohol use. And they again found this generated 2x2 table. In a case control study, you come up with odds ratios as shown here. And the interpretation is similar as the relative risk, that heavy alcohol use is associated with 3.7 times more odds to develop HCC. So I demonstrated a cohort study and case control study in the observational study setting. And observational study means you cannot necessarily control the exposure. The way you can control the exposure and see the outcome would be trials, and some are randomized, others may not be randomized. And the more you can control those variables, you will have internal validity. And if you think about causality as what we are going after in science, there are very variable levels of strength of causality depending on the study design. So this is one of the factors to consider as you try to design your next study. So that's that. The second talk is Elliot Tapper's database research. He outlines 4 steps in database research. And number 1 is to develop the question. Number 2, find the right database to answer your question. Oh, what happened? Number 3, out of the database, you want to define the population of interest. And in order to do that, you may want to use diagnostic and procedure codes in the database, or you can even use medication record if they are available in your database, and define who your population is. And then number 4, step 4, would be to choose the outcomes. So this that will be the disease variable in the previous setup. And the metrics that you've come up with in the setting would be things like relative risk, odds ratio, as we just talked about, hazard ratio, incidence rate, and incidence rate ratio. And you will need to study these individual items to be able to use them in your study. The key slide that I took from Dr. Tapper's slide deck is this one, that there are 2 kinds, largely 2 kinds of exposure and outcome types. Exposure and outcome are simultaneous. There will be cross-sectional study, and in those circumstances, the study method or analytic methods to use will be logistic, linear kind of analysis, and you will have relative risk, data estimates from linear models, or incidence rate ratio, things like that you will come up with. When the timing of exposure and outcome are different, typically you will see exposure at one point and outcome at a later point. That would be time to event type of analysis. And here you may have odds ratios if there's no censoring going on, or hazard ratio, incidence rate, and so forth. So these are the in-depth knowledge you need to develop to be able to do these analysis. So Dr. Tapper's talk will be helpful to get you oriented on these points further. The third talk is systematic review and meta-analysis by Dr. Singh. And he starts with what is a systematic review. It is a comprehensive and systemic search for evidence of published data and ideally unpublished data. So you put them all together. And it is an effort to answer a focused question. And I think that's important. You don't want to be diffuse. You want to be really focused in terms of not only the question itself, but the kind of patient population and the study that are done. It is super important that you don't do this willy-nilly. You need to have protocol, and this should be written out thoughtfully so that you have a principle by which you will review the literature and be able to extract the right information. And utilize measures to reduce biases. Number 5, available evidence is critically appraised and summarized to attempt to answer the question that you developed earlier. And this may or may not involve quantitative synthesis. And the latter will be a meta-analysis. That's a quantitative summary of systematic review. The benefits of meta-analysis, number 1, it gives you greater precision, meaning that you have a lot more power so that the estimate you come up with has a lot narrower confidence interval, more precise. The significance of rare events can be gotten by meta-analysis, again, by the larger sample size. More generalizable data because you have wider inclusion criteria than a single study, and you may be able to identify subgroups where treatment effect may be different by that group. So he outlines 9 steps to conduct these analyses. Again, it is important to develop focused, clinically relevant question, develop protocols, design and conduct a literature search, which is a big chunk of the work. Number 4, select articles of interest. Number 5, extract data that are relevant. Number 6, appraise individual studies to make sure that you have the right data and risk of bias and things like that can be assessed. Number 7, you do the actual analysis, and he will go into more details in his talk how to actually do this analysis. And then once you have analyzed the numbers, you need to understand the implications and make inference with the data that is relevant for clinical practice. And then finally, you can identify gaps in existing literature and make recommendations. So go listen to Dr. Singh in his video. Number 4, Dr. Verna, publishing in high-impact journals. Once you have done your studies, either through meta-analysis, database research, or your own observational studies, as we discussed in the first 3 talks, you want to publish in high-impact journals, obviously. And she talks about how to get started. And the point is, in order for you to get into high-impact journals, you need to have high-impact papers. And that means you need to do a good job with your research. So pick your ideas carefully and think about quality over quantity. It is true that as you start your career, you want to have a few papers under your belt to gain experience and be recognized as an academic physician. But ultimately, you need to deliver quality material. Secondly, read the literature first. You don't want to write a paper only to find out that many other people have done the same work, and that reduces the impact of your work. Number 3, engage mentors and collaborators to guide you to avoid these and other pitfalls. The best research and papers follow the scientific method. Obviously, this is the key to produce good work. Question, hypothesis, analysis, and conclusions need to be based on solid scientific method. Don't say, I will just analyze some data and see where it goes. You need to have a self-discipline to ask pointed questions, develop hypotheses, and write protocols to plan out what your question is, how you're going to generate your data, how to analyze, and how to interpret. You have to have it all outlined at the beginning. Once you have done that you write your paper, the flow of the paper should follow that theme throughout. Ideally, if you do a good job writing a protocol, the paper would be, in the protocol, you say, I will do X, Y, and Z. And the paper will say, I did X, Y, and Z. And this is what I found. Now you have the paper, then you need to pick a target journal where you're going to submit your paper. Impact factor is a popular metric to think about. Consider the impact factor, but that's not all. Who is your target audience is the second question. No matter how high the impact factor is, if it doesn't reach the right audience, your paper may get lost. You want your papers to be read and cited by the right people. You want the reviewers to understand and appreciate your work. You want your message to reach the people who need it. Then you need to think about timing. You can write a paper and submit that to New England Journal of Medicine, and then get rejected. And then you send the same paper to Annals of Internal Medicine, going down the impact factor ladder, and then to gastroenterology, and then to hepatology, and so forth. It will take years before you find the right home. So think about the timing. Do you need to publish your data quickly, especially if you know other people are working on the same topic? You may want to just target appropriately and try to get it out, as opposed to being too ambitious, trying to reach a very high impact journal. If the first journal says no, you need to keep going. You shouldn't be discouraged that my paper is worthless. Every paper has a home. So keep revising, keep trying, and keep submitting until you find the right home. As you write your paper and deal with reviewers' comments, there are some common pitfalls to avoid. Insufficient novelty and/or clinical impact. So if your paper has limited impact, that's not good. Insufficient evidence to support conclusions, or vice versa, your conclusion is too grandiose based on the data that you have generated. That's no good. Problems with study, experimental design, and/or methodological issues. This is why the beginning part of the study is important. You need to have a clearly thought through methodology and protocol, written protocol, to do a good job. Number 4, descriptive, insufficient mechanistic insight. If you're just describing a phenomenon without advanced in the knowledge, your impact is lower. And limited interest to readers and better suited for another specialty journal. So that is finding the right home for your paper, for your work, rather than shooting for the highest impact journal that you think you like. A lot of patience is needed to publish a paper. And a common thing that I advise my fellows is that once you have a reviewer's comment back, the goal of the revision process is to get your paper in, not to educate the reviewer. If you think the reviews are unfair or insufficiently informed, your initial reaction is, okay, I need to show the reviewer that I know more than the reviewer, and then tell them the reviewer is wrong. And that is exactly the unnecessary direction, wrong direction to go. Your job is to get past the reviewers so that your paper is out. So remember the goals as you go through the writing process. So go watch Dr. Berna's presentation. The last presentation is at the request of Dr. Edelman. How to read a basic science paper. This was delivered by Louis Roberts. And I will just show you one summary slide from his deck. And as you read a basic science paper, when you're not a basic scientist, you approach the manuscript review in stages. Don't try to go through the whole thing in one sitting. first you get the big picture or high level review of what the paper is trying to do. And then only then you try to pay attention to the details of methods and analysis. You need to bring an inquiring mindset. Don't accept what's in the paper as given. Think about whether there are flaws as you at the same thought process as you would as you read a clinical paper. Make a positive contribution. What would improve the work? And try to understand what's the delta information here. And then finally, think about questions and what are some of the other things that are not answered, and try to keep making your inquisitive inquiry as you appreciate the new information that you learned from those papers. So those are the 5 talks that we have prepared for you. So I hope you go back and listen to the presentations. So the questions. In a case control study, whether hepatitis B infection causes HCC, the controls are, number 4, subjects without HCC. The second question, this is HCC development in patients with trying to understand what the impact of H. And you have 1,000 individuals, and the endpoints is reached in 30 people. And the problem is there are too few cases and too many variables to analyze. So that's number 2. Number 3 is about the same, adjusting for too many variables. That could also be the right answer. But the key is in this study setup, the statistical power comes from the number of outcomes, which is only 30. So you can't adjust for too many variables. And finally, what is true of meta-analysis? The right answer is number 2. There needs to be some agreement that the studies that you're reviewing have similar setting. If you're trying to summarize studies of very, very, very different kind, it sort of goes against the principle that you can't really, meta-analysis or not, you can't really combine data that are so heterogeneous. So it assumes that all trials are very similar in their conduct of the study. Otherwise, the meta-analysis concept breaks down. So those are my answers for you. And that's the summary for the lectures that we prepare for you. So again,